Today we're in Chicago at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. We're here to speak to Professor David Dranove. Professor Dranove is an economist who's passionate about promoting positive change in the healthcare industry. Professor Dranove has a new book called Code Red and a blog by the same name. Today we're here at Northwestern University Kellogg School of Management with Professor David Dranove. Professor Dranove, thank you for being here today.
It's a real pleasure.
So the first thing I want to know is all health systems can improve. As health practitioners, what do you think the role we have to play in this?
Well, the practitioners, physicians, control almost all of the health dialogue. And I think it's very important for practitioners to understand how the money gets spent.
Yeah. And so is that related to our pricing, or should we be looking at budgeting, or what do you think we should be doing as part of that? A couple of tips that you think we should be doing.
I think before you get into the nitty-gritty of pricing or the boring issues of budgeting and accounting, I think the most important thing for practitioners to understand is that any individual provider is part of what we call in business strategy a value chain. That ultimately the goal of the health system is to take a patient who's not doing well and make them better. And that involves a large number of individuals and organizations, from the initial diagnosis of the illness or even before that in prevention, through diagnosis, through treatment, diagnostic testing, physical therapy, aftercare, nursing care. This is a long process, and I think it's very important for each provider to understand that they're not there on an island, that they are part of this value chain.
And when you say they're not there on the island, who are they there with? Do you think we should be planning health systems with health professionals or with consumers, or where do you see that going?
I think that everybody is involved in the production of health. I think, let's take an example, a patient who has asthma. It's up to the patient to understand symptoms to suggest that the problem is flaring up. It's up to individuals that patient may contact other than their routine asthma care provider. That patient may contact other providers. It's up to those people to understand those patients' needs and to red flag when problems are occurring. And it's up to their regular provider for asthma care to understand what are the options for treatment. Are there nurses who can monitor the patient's care? Are there tertiary care providers that might offer some innovative treatment that they're not aware of? Each provider is part of this chain.
Yeah. And with that, with the value chain, what are the influences to that in health particularly?
Well, I think a major factor that we have to think about in the value chain is the information that's available to each participant in the value chain. One of the big initiatives we have here in the United States, and we've seen it elsewhere in the world, is creation of integrated electronic health records. So that wherever you are in the treatment process, you have the benefit of everybody else who's been involved in the treatment process, that their knowledge is not just scribbled down illegibly on some note, but it's right there in front of you to understand what that patient has been through, what tests they've received, and so forth. Another important influence, of course, is incentives. Patients generally have insurance, and very generous insurance, so they don't have financial incentives. They don't feel a responsibility to take a look at the cost of care. The providers worry about their own personal financial incentives, and that usually means that it's the government who's holding the purse strings that worries about the cost of care. And that kind of fragmented set of incentives doesn't always lead to the best decision making.
And as managers, particularly in some parts of our health service where it's free, how do we manage that? How do we manage our employees and manage our patients so that we do get the best care?
Well, I think the providers are, of course, thinking about the patient's health. It's natural for them not to think about cost. the patients are insured, they're not thinking about cost.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's necessarily a wise idea to tell the providers, we want you to worry about costs while you're making these medical decisions.
Okay.
However, I think it is appropriate for those who are holding the purse strings to provide some guidelines. And I know Australia currently does this with the Pharmacy Benefit Advisory Council,
Yeah.
which takes a look at certain drugs and says these are not cost effective. And providers, once they look at the research and they understand that this has been scrutinized by an independent body, are generally receptive to recommendations that do take cost into account.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we need to share a lot more information, but also be open to external influences of getting that information that we don't necessarily talk about. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And here in the United States in the 1990s, we had more of a command and control system, which health insurance companies, private companies, were trying to dictate to providers what they perceived to be cost-effective or cost-ineffective care. And providers and patients rebelled. It just wasn't working. And since that time, we've moved to a voluntary system in which the information is shared. And rather than the insurers saying, we know this and therefore you're going to follow our instructions, they're saying, we've learned this, and if you take a look at the same information, we think you'll reach the same conclusions.
Great. So also there's an aspect of doing research as well, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And we're seeing that now with a major proposal in the current health reform movement to create a comparative effectiveness institute. But actually all that will be a U.S. version of what Australia currently does for prescription drugs, what England does in their National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which is to provide guidance on which costly technologies are more effective and which are less effective. But even this doesn't go far enough, because that continues the kind of siloization, if there is such a word, of the medical process. It tells the surgeon at a particular point in time, this procedure should be chosen over that procedure, when in fact we need to look at the entire episode of care, and for chronic care we need to go beyond the episode and decide what is the treatment process that's most effective, and that information still needs to be developed and shared.
Great. And just finally, one tip for health practitioners and one tip for managers from what you've learnt.
I think one tip for health practitioners is to understand that a benefit cost analysis, which we all do in our heads, is this worth it, is something that everybody does differently. And that you are going to reach a different conclusion from the patient, and you're going to reach a different conclusion from the payer. That all of those perspectives are valid, and that you should not view the other players in the value chain as your enemies. Instead, you should treat them as all part of a single value net and collectively try to get the most out of the healthcare system. And the other audience?
For managers, if we're managing a health professional department.
If you're managing a health professional department, I think what we've learned here from many failures in the United States is the need to have good management information systems. We can't tell you in the United States who are good doctors, who are bad doctors, who are efficient doctors, who are inefficient doctors, what the most efficient production process is in terms of when you should kick the patient out of the hospital and send them to home care or physical therapy or so forth. And the reason we can't is because our information systems are god-awful. Any other industry looking at the information systems available to healthcare managers would be embarrassed for us. The fact that we can't tell what something costs, what the quality is, who should be producing what and at what time, and that's ridiculous. You can't run a business enterprise that way. We've allowed that to happen for too long, and so many of our failures to improve the efficiency of the healthcare system through management innovations have failed because of the lack of appropriate management information systems.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor Dranove.
You're welcome. It's a real delight to talk to you.
Nice to meet you. Professor Dranove, thank you so much for your time today.
I've really enjoyed it.